Welcome to the Case for Conservation podcast, where we explore some of the underexplored aspects of biodiversity conservation and challenge some of the less convincing conventional wisdom in this field. I'm your host, Andre Marder. Before I get started, I have to announce that I've decided to discontinue the mini episodes of the podcast. This is for purely practical reasons. I simply don't have the time to commit to doing them every month, and I prefer to focus on producing the best quality monthly interview discussions that I can. I have removed the mini episodes from the podcast feed and the website, but if anyone would like to access them specifically, just leave me a comment on the website and I'd be happy to share them with you. Okay, on to this month's episode. I've been listening to the global narratives on social justice unfold, and it seems to me that we're at a sort of crossroads in the Western world, where the wrong decisions could set us back quite profoundly. Identity politics has become the order of the day, and society seems to be dangerously polarized. In this charged atmosphere, the arguments that I have found the most refreshing are the somewhat contrarian views of Black public figures like Glenn Lowry, Coleman Hughes, Aisha Takambi, and others. But none of them are conservationists, and I wanted to address racial discrimination in particular in the context of conservation. So I reached out to conservationist and BBC TV presenter Gillian Burke. Gillian's ancestry couldn't be much more diverse. She's described on Wikipedia as being of Afro-Trinidadian, Seminole, Mauritian, and Somalian descent. But it's not just because of Gillian's heritage that I invited her to have this discussion. Although my views don't match hers completely on the subject, her online commentary has shown that she's reflected carefully on it, and most importantly, she responds in a really forward-looking and constructive way. I wasn't sure how much there was to say specifically about conservation in this space, but as it turns out, I think that we could have spoken for several more hours on the topic. So this is not a comprehensive overview, but I think at the very least it offers some food for thought. I should add that the discussion really only starts focusing on racial discrimination just before the halfway mark. But I thought it was worth getting into Gillian's backstory in quite a lot of detail because of the relevance. This episode is not about the science, but more about lived experience and points of view. So I suggest that you listen to the whole thing, and there are some bits and pieces in the first half which relate quite importantly to the second half. But if you're listening specifically for the conversation on discrimination, then you can skip to about the 26-minute mark. You were generous enough to respond to my invitation to have this discussion, even though we didn't know each other, we'd never met. And not only that, but also to discuss a pretty, I would say, heavy and touchy topic, but also a very important one. And that is the topic of discrimination or perceived discrimination in conservation. But before we get into that, I always find it interesting to find out from guests how they became interested in conservation. I find there's always a story behind that. And I know a little bit about yours, but would you mind explaining to the audience how you became interested in conservation and how you decided to pursue it as a career?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me on to your podcast, Andre. And like you say, we don't know each other. So it's the first time we're talking, which is an interesting way of the world nowadays, isn't it? Yeah. So before I answer your question directly, I guess, I was really happy to come onto this podcast because I did listen to some of your previous episodes and frankly just really impressed. I enjoyed the level of detail that you and your guests were able to get into each of the discussions. So on that basis alone, it was an easy yes to accept the invitation. And if anything, slightly intimidating because you've got some pretty knowledgeable, experienced guests. But to talk about discrimination, it takes a lot of energy, and I will get into the ins and the outs of it, as we go through the podcast. I recorded another podcast for a very different type of interviewer yesterday, and we got into that conversation as well. And what tends to happen is sometimes I can have these conversations, and other times, like yesterday, it was really lighthearted, and we right at the end just a couple of questions about diversity, and I came away feeling exhausted by it, because like every time I am opened up into the space of talking about discrimination and race and equality, it takes a big emotional kind of like dig deep into being honest and wanting to open up and have a constructive conversation. So I say all that because, I'm nervous. I'm going to be honest, nervous to go there and then talk about other things, particularly because I don't expect that we may not see eye to eye on everything. So that just sets the scene. And I guess it's really nice to talk about how I got into conservation, because I got into conservation and environmental work and biology because for me, when I was in school, I was a pretty keen student. I was one of those kids, right? I liked going to school. School was a great experience. I liked to learn. So all of that stuff was, it wasn't a struggle for me. But what I noticed about the sciences, and particularly biology, was it was the only subjects where we weren't concentrating on human endeavor and human achievement and human anything. Like to me, when I sat in biology, it was nothing to do with humans. It was all about everything else. And for some reason, that was the appeal for me. And I didn't necessarily think I was going to make a career out of biology, somehow turn that into a career. But it was like a time out from everything else, because in history and English literature, even in maths to a certain extent, I felt like, it was all about, well, what can we do? What can we get out of this? What have we done? What have we accomplished? What have we achieved as a species? Maybe not in those words, but that's what it felt like. It was a lot of focus on our species, whereas biology, I got to just focus on anything else but, So that was the kind of really basic appeal in a kind of childlike brain, I guess, the way I would interpret it now. And I think, like probably many people, I didn't necessarily have like a laser sharp focus on what I was going to do with my life and how I was going to get there. Quite the opposite. I've sort of managed to get through life by just putting, my best foot forward and taking the next the next step that I can. But through my childhood, so I was born in Kenya. I spent the first 10 years in Kenya. That was absolutely formative in terms of setting me up for how I see the world and how it works, both human and otherwise. And my mom worked for the United Nations Environmental Program. So courtesy of her, I, from a very young age, was exposed to ideas and concepts around, I guess, put simply, that all was not well in the world, So we were born in the same year, 1974. So sorry to age you as well as me. But by the time I guess I was, going to my mom's office, I was 5 or 6, or early 80s. I was very aware that there were environmental issues, that, like I say, all was not well in the world. And then coupled with that, so my parents were unusual, particularly for that generation, that my mom was the one who had the professional career. My dad was a mechanic, but he was the outdoors person, and he was the person that took us out into the bush and took us out on safari and made sure we, he loved all of that, right? So dad was the practical, physical, lived experience of being out in the wilds, and mom was the ideas person. And between the two of them and, other influences as I was growing up, it just became part of me. And then at 10 years old, because of my mom working for the United Nations, we got moved to Vienna, Austria. So this is like the mid 80s now. And that was a huge change in, well, just everything. But then my focus in terms of my, just every day was, all of a sudden I was a teenager in a European city. And I did all the kind of teenagery things, I listened to music on my headphones and, just kind of quite surly and, but got really into performing arts. And that was the thing that I thought I was going to do with my life. But then hit a point, just, I guess, final year in secondary school and high school, where we're now making choices about where we're going to go, what we're going to do. And I really wanted to apply to drama school, but was discouraged at the time. I was just told, like, pretty blankly by someone who I consider actually really said this out of care rather than out of spite or anything nasty. I think this was said with love, but it was like, there are just not many roles for Black women in theatre and film. I mean, look around you. And I did. And I would look at all like the Hollywood films, and I look at all the theatre, reviews, and I think, oh yeah, that's right. The best I'll be able to do with this is maybe teach acting and drama. And then almost like alongside that, I had this bursary, this funding to go to university. And for me, the kind of, it wasn't like the next best thing. It was in tandem. I was like, well, I also really love biology. And in my head, I was like, maybe what I could do is go back to Kenya after I've done a biology degree and work for the Wildlife Service, for the Kenya Wildlife Service, and basically just live out my days bumbling around in a Land Rover. So that seemed like a really good prospect at the time. So that was the decision. I did biology. And then from there, I came to Britain, did biology in Bristol. Bristol is where the BBC Natural History Unit is headquartered. So again, by osmosis, I just walked past it on my way to and from lectures for 3 years. Didn't quite sort of clock that might be something I would do in my future life, but it was just a presence. And then long story short, graduated with my biology degree, thought about doing sort of further education, decided that wasn't for me, bumbled around doing all sorts of random jobs. And eventually, after a few years of that, landed back in Bristol and thought, well, maybe the Natural History Unit, the BBC, might be a place for me to go and knock on the door. And I literally went to the reception desk and said, who do I speak to find out how to work here? And very lovely receptionist who said, well, this is the name of the person, and what you'll need to do is send a CV and da-da-da-da-da. And after embellishing my CV like you wouldn't believe, I got my first work experience gig in the basement, in the cellar of the Natural History Unit, logging hours of footage that I didn't even know why I was doing what I was doing, but I was there. And that was the beginning.
Then you made the transition at some point, quite recently, as far as I understand, from being behind the cameras and behind the scenes at the BBC to being a presenter, right?
That's correct, yeah. So once I sort of got, my foot in the door, as it were, doing work experience for a very long time, I, slowly worked my way up through as a researcher, then an assistant producer. And then just at the point where I got my first fully fledged directing role is when I also discovered I was pregnant with my son. So that slightly changed the script. And I actually stepped away completely from filmmaking and had my kids quite close to one, within 2 years of each other. So for quite a long period, actually, I was a stay-at-home mom. I did try and get back into TV work, but I found it really hard to do both. Mm-hmm. So I actually consider that I was very fortunate to have those years at home with my children. That made a huge difference to everything, the way I see the world now. But as they got back to the age, sort of both in school, and I was at that point where I was starting to think, okay, so what next? So up until that point, and all those years when I'd worked on production, I'd never even wanted to be a presenter. I'd worked on productions with presenters and just was like, no, that's not for me, because the way I saw it was that you had so much more editorial control on production, particularly if you're producing, directing. And I felt that's where I wanted to be. I wanted to be, have more ownership over the storytelling and the narratives than what I perceived a presenter had. So sort of at the point where my children are back in school, I'm thinking about what next. And I considered all kinds of things, because by this point, it's like, how can I make this work and still be at home when the kids get home from school? So I considered like retraining, going back to uni, maybe becoming a physiotherapist. That was quite appealing. I really considered lots of things. And then eventually started doing some voiceover work, which was kind of happening alongside another experience. Now, by this point, I'd moved to Cornwall, and it's a peninsula, so you're never very far from the sea. And what I started to see, as you know, I'm a stay-at-home mother with my two children, spending time, on the coast path, which is like these walking routes along the coastline and on the beaches, was just huge amounts of plastic being washed up on the beaches. Now, this is something I'd read about, something I'd even reported about in TV programs I'd made. But it was the first time that I just saw it happening on a place that I was starting to take ownership of, in terms of, this is my home, this is where I live, and this is where my children are growing up, and this isn't okay. I really felt it viscerally. And all of these things happening in tandem. And alongside that, so where am I now? So, we've rolled the clock on quite a bit now. So we're talking about 2015, 2016. And then 2017 is when there was a paper that was published, an open letter to humanity. It had, I think, 20,000 signatory scientists who put their name to it. And it was 25 years on from the Rio Earth Summit in 92. So for me, these are big dates in my mind. Like 92 is when I started my degree. And now here I am in 2017. These scientists have put this paper out, and they've said pretty much every single environmental indicator things have gotten worse. And not just worse, they've gotten worse by a long stretch, all except CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons. And for me, there was like this kind of twin thing happening. Like I was seeing like physically the evidence of environmental degradation happening alongside this paper. And all of a sudden these dates just landed in my head as to, well, this is a milestone for me, because that was the year when I started my degree. That's the year when this happened. That's the year. And now look at us. And that all sort of crunched down to a single moment where I came across, by virtue of talking to some of the amazing conservation workers here in Cornwall, someone told me about a citizen science survey that had been conducted in the spring. This is 2016 now. And a very obscure little species of hermit crab had been discovered on one of our local beaches. And it was discovered by a brilliant naturalist who was old enough to recognize it as something that he had known as a child, but had been wiped out, had been made extinct in Britain as a result of a big oil spill, the Torrey Canyon oil spill. That was in 1969. That was the biggest human-made disaster at the time. And it wiped out loads of stuff, including this one species, Clibonarius erythropus. And all of a sudden, here it is again, 2016. How did it get here? Nobody knew. It wasn't part of anyone's management plan. Nobody, reintroduced it. It just found its way back to British shores. So I took that story because I was like, well, I still have that bug in me. Like, I want to share this story if I can. So I took it to a BBC program called Springwatch, hugely popular here. And I was skeptical as to whether they'd take it. It's a good news story, but it's an invertebrate, and it's a tiny invertebrate at that. And they were like, yeah, no, that's fantastic. We'll send a crew down. And the next thing I know that, I'm going to present it as well. So the whole thing happened in a kind of weird way. And that it wasn't that I was completely caught off guard in terms of presenting, because by that point, because of the voiceover work, I had been asked like, oh, well, you're doing voiceover. Would you consider doing on screen as well? And I kept saying, no. But then when I got this offer on this one show, which in my mind, especially at the time, was the only place where I thought you could really get genuine conservation stories out onto TV. I kind of felt that, well, and also, frankly, I think you only get asked once for something like that in life. I just had to say yes, So that was the transition from working behind the camera to in front of the camera. And it was a bumpy transition.
From the bit that I've heard about you and some of the interviews that I've seen you giving, I've never heard you actually say that you're particularly devoted to inspiring others, but I just kind of get the impression that is probably an important part of your work. And I wanted to just sort of ask, is that an important part of what you do? And because you're now fairly high profile, right? As soon as you appear in front of a camera, your influence is amplified.
God, yeah, I tell you, that's a scary thought when I think about my influence being amplified. Um, but no, absolutely. Maybe I don't say it explicitly because it just hopefully is implicit in everything I do and say. I like to talk, first of all, you probably got that. And I don't even know how to say, like, without, sounding a bit cliched, but I don't know why I wouldn't want to enthuse about the way the world works. And for me, that's the whole thing. I avoid talking about nature and the natural world, and it's a recent thing that I'm actually consciously doing because
You mean
I'm really
as a separate thing? You mean avoiding?
yeah, yeah, and it's something that I'm really kind of consciously doing. Having listened to lots of other amazing speakers and thinkers in this space about how language and language matters, and so simply by using the word nature we're separating ourselves from it. It's something other than us, and so I'm trying to unlearn and relearn a lot at the moment. So when I think about what I do, it's not just about like enthusing about nature and then humans are somewhere else doing something that they shouldn't be doing. That's why I keep saying it's how the world works, because it ultimately that's kind of what I'm interested in, is how things work and how it all fits together. And that could be ecology if you want to call it a name, and it could be, but ultimately that's what it is.
Right.
And for me the biggest challenge is, can I go into a primary school and explain anything that I know in a way that primary school children walk away and go, oh, I get that now. That's like a great challenge. And honestly, primary school, like that falls apart so quickly. Like I go in there with such great intentions. I'm like, I know I've got this down. And then, I'm talking about maybe, how they can encourage birds into their garden, into their school grounds by leaving bird feeders out. And then they're on to rats. And so it's a real challenge communicating with children, but one that I enjoy very much. But I would say yes, enthusing and communicating about how the world works, biology, nature, ecology, whatever you want to call it, it's like something sets off in me and I almost can't stop.
Uh-huh.
And I think when I think back on the moments where I'm like, oh yeah, no, this really is what I like to do. It's when I did my biology degree, most of my flatmates, all bar one, were doing anything other than a science. So they were all like humanities or law or, English or classics or whatever. And I would get back from a day at uni lectures and I would just have what they would call the nerd attack, where I couldn't stop myself. I had to tell them what I'd learned that day and why it mattered to them. And it was a brilliant, like I didn't see it like that at the time, but it was like a training ground because they were like from the get-go, they were not interested. They just were like, oh, okay, here we go again. I was like, no, 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 you are going to love this by the time I finish. So that was like a really good sort of, and they'll laugh because they still like, oh, here she goes again. But possibly the favorite job in all of the roles I've performed in TV, and I'm probably doing myself a huge career-ending moment here, but anyway, um, was was actually the most junior role that I did as a researcher. I loved being a researcher because I basically, as the way I saw it, I got to spend my days and looking up papers for the things that I thought would make good stories. And then I got to go, and so this is the days before everyone just emailed. We actually spoke to each other on the phone. I got to call these scientists up and talk to them and get them to explain it again and tell me again how it works. Okay, and what if I said it like this? Will that be okay? Yes. I loved that process of like, how can we take this and put it in, and I don't want to say layman's because that sounds very condescending, but
Well,
how can we?
everyday language, right? Just
Yeah.
mhm. So your job was really to interpret that what you found in papers into language that would be understood by anyone who is listening to the resulting program.
Yeah, I mean, interpret, and I would, if I may, add another layer to that, which was like find the wonder in it. The,
Hmm.
the bit that's like, oh, because to me, it's still the most exciting part about science is still the fringe, the edge, the place where the models start to fall apart, where we're still not sure how it works. To me, that's like being an explorer. You're going to unknown territory. and it will change you because you will come back with new understandings. And that to me is what science in its purest, most beautiful form is. I think science in service to policy making and legislation and management is necessary, but you got to find the wonder back in that. That's what keeps me going through it all, is keeping, that sense of like, there's still so much we don't know. And there's so much that even when we find out, we're like, how could it possibly work like this? One of my favorite stories is some research that was done in Wytham Woods, which is one of the most studied patches of woodland in the world. I believe it's connected with Oxford University. And they did this study where they found that great tits will lay their eggs, but then time the hatching of their eggs to the point when winter moth caterpillars are emerging. And those winter moth caterpillars time their hatching to when the oak leaves are just starting to bud. And this happens at different times in different parts of the wood, depending on the microclimates. How do they do it? So it's great that we know all that stuff. But then the final question, but how? We could be so clever, but there's still so much we don't know. And that to me is the wonder of it all.
And that's in one of the most studied pieces of woodland in the world. So what don't we know about the depths of the ocean, for example? Gillian, I'd like to talk a bit about representation of people of color in conservation. You mentioned in the arts earlier on. In conservation, I have noticed through my career in different countries, that would be South Africa mostly, but also to some extent Canada and Switzerland, and then just sort of viewing other places from afar. My impression is that people of color are underrepresented based on the population of the country being looked at. And I know that in South Africa, certainly part of the reason is that people are coming out of poverty, and those who can make it to university are kind of expected, I think, by those around them and themselves to pursue a more lucrative career than conservation. So that's always struck me as one reason for this lack of representation. In a variety of countries, another possible reason would be how conservation has kind of sidelined local communities, which more often than not happen to be people of color. And I would imagine that attaches quite a stigma to conservation. So just kind of setting the scene there, but I wanted to ask what you think are the likely reasons for underrepresentation. Well, first of all, I should ask whether you agree with that assumption of mine. And if so, what do you think are the likely reasons for that underrepresentation? And then do you think that discrimination has anything to do with it? And I guess that this is a bit tricky because it might depend on which part of the world you're looking at, but it would be interesting to know what your views are of the UK, which is what you probably know best.
Yeah. Wow, there's a lot there. But I'll do my best to unpack that. Just to connect back maybe a bit to kind of my journey to this point. So I sometimes have to just laugh to myself that I've ended up in a position where I get asked these questions a lot, right? Because, when I think about it, sometimes I'm like, wow. So I was sort of on my way, my passion at the time was like, I wanted to be an actress and I wanted to be on stage and performing arts. And I was sort of steered away from that clearly because I was told there wasn't going to be many roles for someone like me. And it was going to be difficult to make a living doing the job that I wanted to do. So I kind of stepped into biology and this space, environmental conservation space, almost as a result of, I wouldn't say it was active discrimination, but almost because of discrimination. So this was meant to be the place where I would not have to really think about like humans very much, basically. So I find that there's a little irony there that makes me sometimes chuckle to myself. What I love about this is actually, I'm forced to think about a much more global view than what I'm used to when I talk about my role on the BBC Springwatch programme, because I generally speak to a British audience. So what I could say is, in terms of the UK nature and environmental sector, it is not an assumption, it's not an impression, but it is, measurable, so that it is a very underrepresented sector. It's second only to farming and agriculture. I can't remember the exact figure, but it's over 95% white. And so that's not representative of the population as a whole. That's just, that is established, and that's a well-quoted figure now by many of the nature and environmental NGOs over the course of the last year, over 2020, particularly after the murder of George Floyd and all the protests subsequent to that. It has brought back into focus or back into the spotlight racial, social injustice, inequality, all that stuff has become, particularly last year. And many, I can't tell you, I lost count of the number of organizations that got in touch with me to sit on a panel, sit in a discussion about how to make their organizations more diverse and more inclusive. So that's the kind of British scene, if you like. I honestly don't think I could speak with authority about anywhere else other than to say, well, I'm a well-traveled Black woman who has lived and worked in pretty much every continent except Antarctica. And I've done that for the last 20 years. So I've had experiences in the fields, in remote parts of the Amazon, Costa Rica, Borneo. I've worked in Australia. So I've worked in lots of places, and I've had personal experiences in every single one, good and bad, of what it is to be not the person they were expecting to show up doing the job that I do. And my name doesn't help anyone at all. My name's so English sounding, isn't it? It's Gillian Burke. So, I don't know how to warn people, I'm not what you think, when I show up on a location. Now it helps, obviously, because I got a public profile. I don't have to get around that one anymore. But yeah, so my impressions and how I speak on this subject is I try and really, I can quote, I can talk about what the situation is in Britain, and then I can talk about my personal experiences as well, both growing up and then as in my professional life in terms of discrimination. What I find interesting is I get asked this a lot, and I never get to ask anyone else, do you think there is discrimination? Mm-hmm. Because I'm actually curious, how do other people see this? Because I know what I think and feel because that's my lived experience, but what do other people think? So I just thought, just to turn the tables a bit, not to, make it awkward, but I just wondered what you think.
One thing I can say is that in South Africa, it's been 10 years since I've lived there, but certainly for the past 20 years or so, there's been a lot of effort at the university level to include people of color in all fields, including conservation. When I was in my second year, there were 3 Black students who, because of apartheid, didn't have the same level of education as everyone else. So myself and some others were providing tutelage to help them along. So that kind of effort's being made. And I think that this is 20 years ago. So I'm hoping that those efforts are a little bit more sophisticated than they were back then. But even then, the efforts were being made. And then elsewhere, the rest of my experience is mostly in the international realm. So sort of UN and UN related, which you're probably fairly familiar with through your mom. And there, I was just used to working in an incredibly diverse environment. So diversity was never an issue at all. But having said that, I know that people don't change that quickly, and sometimes it takes generations to change. So without having experienced too many examples myself, I have no doubt that there is plenty of discrimination out there, racial and otherwise. But my impression is that we've made a lot of progress. What worries me sometimes about the global narrative now is that there's often an assumption that racism is the reason for something when it may or may not be. It's not to say it isn't, but it's also not necessarily to say that it is. I kept on thinking back to my time in Montreal. For some reason, whenever I went to places like Home Depot, some of these bigger stores, I think it's because I have a habit of ambling around. I like just to walk up and down the aisles and see what there is. I'm not a very strategic shopper. And again, I was targeted by the guards in the shop. They'd sort of appear at the end of the aisle and sort of look down and see what I was doing. It was very clear that I was being watched. And I just sort of thought, if I were a person of color, I would probably assume that was the reason why, but I'm visibly not. So there was some other reason. I was doing something else. And yeah, the point there is just that I think that discrimination exists in conservation and outside conservation, but it's not as often the reason for things going wrong as it may be made out to be.
No, I'm just really interested because what I find kind of fascinating actually is that we're born in the same year. You grew up in South Africa. We both lived through the end of apartheid in different ways. And yeah, I guess maybe that's just, the part of my the way my mind is wired. I'm very curious. I like to try and, I tend to operate from a position where I'm not sure I have all the answers. I'm not sure I actually understand this. I want to know more. But so yeah, so to be a, kind of a more like obliging podcast guest, I'll answer your question. How about that? Um, so there's so many levels of discrimination and racism, and there's certainly, plenty of it, experiences I could cite about what, I would describe as like clear overt racism in my personal experience in my working life. But what I think personally is more helpful is some of the, and I don't want to say systemic, but maybe some of like the kind of really, really fundamental, foundational things that I think, like I'm only just starting to notice and realize. So a little bit of what we talked about earlier about how I'm trying to consciously change the language I use when I talk about nature. And so I'm using, these like invisible quotation marks at the moment because I try and avoid using the word at all now. Because I've really noticed how it shifts the perspective when I stop saying nature and I start talking about wild spaces as opposed to urbanized spaces, because it's kind of all in the same, the same system we're talking about. And where this came from was I was attending a conference earlier this year called the Oxford Real Farming Conference. Now, if you've never come across it, it probably sounds like the most parochial event you could imagine. This is like one of the most amazing, progressive, global events I've come across in environmental or agriculture sectors. And more, I'm sort of leaning into both spaces. So during this conference, the keynote speaker is a lady, an extraordinary woman called Rebecca Hoskin. And she was a camera woman before she became, I don't think she became a farmer. She returned back to her family farm. This is all in Britain, in the south of Britain. And Rebecca was talking about her experiences when she was a camera woman for Natural History TV. So I sort of was aware of her work because we were kind of in the same space at the same time. But I never met her personally. And she's talking about all the traveling she did to very remote places, working with indigenous peoples and all sorts of continents. And she crunched it down to this idea, which was that most indigenous languages and cultures do not have a single word for nature. It simply doesn't exist as a concept. And it literally like shook my world. I was like, what? Really? Is that possible? And then she went on to explain kind of, how this set her on a train of thought about, well, is this the root of when we disconnected with nature? How, maybe this is our relationship with the natural world. It's this otherness. It's separating ourselves from it. It's not putting humans in the picture rather than on top of, some imaginary hierarchy or pyramid. So that for me is almost like the foundation of the space that you and I work in, conservation, environmental biology. When we're thinking about, is this an inclusive space? And I prefer that word to discriminating. Is this an inclusive space? Are we telling, well, I think of stories because of the work I do, but, are we asking the questions in a way that allows other perspectives to join in? And so, yes, we could do, and should, frankly, I think, should be looking at, well, is the representation in these sectors representative of the population at large? And, and if so, why not? And what can we do about that? That's a separate conversation. But I also think that this isn't just, I use this analogy. It's not just about making room at the table. It's trying to build a new table together. Because frankly speaking, from a biodiversity, ecological crisis, climate crisis, pollution, as I said earlier, the indicators are not good. The measurable indicators that tell us that water quality, air quality, soil fertility, all these systems are reaching tipping points. And all earthly systems are under stress at the moment, enormous stress. And in my view, the pandemic, and therefore the social unrest that we're experiencing, all of this is connected. So when we think about how to make conservation and the environmental sector more inclusive, it's absolutely essential, because in a sense it's like the ship's going down and we need all hands on deck. But like currently, there are people stuck below deck and they're not being allowed up, or they can't get up, or we don't even know they're down there, to keep that analogy going. So I can feel angry about things. I can get really upset about it. And I will let myself have those moments, but then I have to kind of pick myself up and go, right, so how do we move forward from this? And for me, like, because this is my job as a storyteller, it's like, okay, how do we tell better stories? How do we tell stories that more people recognize themselves in it, can see themselves in it? Because at the moment we don't. And that's not just in the kind of filmmaking point of view, but also I think conservation, just wider. So it's more than just visibility. It's about, really going to the heart of, why do we describe things the way we do? Why do we use the language we do? And are we right asking the best questions, which, is the root of good science, really, is asking good questions. So that's my view on it. What I would say, just as a little kind of extra thought, is the representation is lacking, but it's also about visibility. So the people that are in that space are simply not being seen or heard because they're not getting the platforms, the support, the amplification. There was a hashtag, a social media hashtag last year called Black Birders Week. It was started in the States. It was in response to an incident in Central Park last summer in New York, where a birder called Christian Cooper, who is Black, was just caught in an altercation with a white woman, and it was all caught on camera. She called the police saying that he was threatening her, and it turns out that that wasn't at all the case. But it was just, it was a snapshot of, and like with the volume dialed right up, of probably what I've experienced, and many people will experience a lot, of people of color. And I think that's where it's very difficult. That's why I asked you that question. Like, do you think there's discrimination? Because there are things that you may not see or perceive as discrimination that feels like discrimination, that is discrimination. So anyway, so this incident with Christian Cooper then sparked a hashtag on social media called Black Birders Week. And it was encouraging Black birders to post on the hashtag so people could see that actually we exist. There are people who are of color who like to go out with their binoculars into wild spaces because they like to watch wildlife, and we're not doing anything dodgy or shifty or, suspicious. And what that did for me, let alone everyone else, was I was like, holy cow, there's loads of us out there. I didn't know that. So I think it's a question of representation and visibility. So it's offering up platforms, it's making that space, it's amplifying voices. And there's so many activists of color, whether it's indigenous, Black, or mixed ethnicities or whatever. But there's loads of activists out there. I've just seen a review copy of a book by a young Bangladeshi British birder, an activist called Maya Rose Craig. And she's produced this beautiful book for children, for Gen Zers, as she calls it, which is showcasing all the activists around the world from as many places as she could find, environmental activists and campaigners and conservationists, all of them very young. And it's a beautiful book. It's called We Have a Dream. And I just thought, the more we see this, the more it becomes normalized. And then it allows other people to see themselves, like other children go, oh, I could be that person. So like when I looked around, when someone told me there wasn't the roles for Black women in theatre and film, I believed them because I couldn't see any or hardly any. So that's what can change. And then it just opens things up. It opens up possibilities for other people to see themselves in that space and go, oh, I could do that.
Back to the Christian Cooper incident, my impression with that was, so, and I have no proof for this, but my impression is that if you took a random sample of dog walkers, so this lady she was walking her dog, right? And the reason why Christian Cooper confronted her was because she had her dog off the leash in a place where she wasn't supposed to. And she was screaming for the dog to come back to her and scaring all the birds away. So he was quite rightly annoyed by the whole thing. Although he seemed to have been very pleasant about it. He was just filming her and she didn't like the fact that he was filming her. But my impression is that if you took a random sample of white lady dog walkers, that the majority wouldn't have reacted in the way that she did. My impression is that she seemed to be fairly neurotic, and she was definitely weaponizing the racial issue. She specifically mentioned, as she was calling the cops, she said, "There's an African American man threatening me," which he wasn't doing. So she was very clearly weaponizing it. But I just kind of think that although incidents like that happen, that they are the exception rather than the rule. And I was just wondering, in your experience, I mean, if you don't mind drawing on particular incidents, can you kind of tell me how your lived experience has reflected, or how your lived experience tells you that that is not so much the exception?
Yeah. So in that video with Christian Cooper, she was very activated emotionally. Let's say put it that way, massively. But what was instantly identified for anyone with any experience with the police in America is that simply saying he was an African American, a black man, was escalating the situation.
Absolutely, yeah.
There's no question about it. And that will happen countless times. Like, bizarrely, it's kind of happened to me in the States years ago in Florida when I went through a phase of having really, really short hair because it was just practical, especially sort of working in the field and stuff. I just would just do a buzz cut. So I had a really short hair. And I guess I did get mistaken for a boy a lot, which I found a bit distressing sometimes. And I was in the bathroom in a place called Ocala Springs. It's a beautiful place. You can see manatees, you go diving, there's alligators. It's amazing. And I came out of the cubicle, I was washing my hands, and there was this young child. It's actually the first time I'm sharing this story with anyone, really. What happened is I'm washing my hands, and then this child goes, "Mama, there's a boy. There's a black boy." And the second the word black came out, this door flung open. And what was not right about that situation in the mom's head was the child had said boy first, then black boy. And it was something about being a black boy in the ladies, which just created a reaction that was disproportionate, but a reaction that even in the split second that it took me to understand what was going on around me, because obviously in my head I'm just washing my hands and minding my own business, that I understood I needed to very, very quickly establish what the situation was, that I was the right gender to be in that bathroom, and B, not a threat, even though I was black. So that's me, little me. I think, as someone who grew up in South Africa, you'll understand there's such deep history in America that's born out of like really deep trauma. And like in South Africa, until people really kind of go, okay, this is still playing out today. I think that was what the Truth and Reconciliation was an attempt at doing. It might have helped, I don't know. But there's still a long way to go. I agree there's progress, but there's still a long way to go. And I think one of the things that maybe doesn't get talked about enough, in my opinion, is how the way we communicate now also creates, I feel I have to work so much harder than I ever have to make sure that I still feel like I'm representing my views and trying to share how I see the world in the hope that it then creates common ground. I'm definitely someone who, because maybe similar to you, actually, you work in an international space with lots of expatriates. I went to an international school and I had the experience of, for those 8 years in Vienna, of at least in school, being in an environment where there wasn't necessarily anyone who had a majority or minority. It was a very genuinely international school. And so I had that like lived experience of just having mates from everywhere, and we all stuck up for each other. And when we went out into the city as teenagers do and hung out, if there was ever like a moment where I was discriminated against, and that happened a lot, I wouldn't get served in cafes, if we went and tried to sit down and get served. But, my friends would, like, if there was the faintest whiff that I was going to get treated differently, we'd all just I mean, I didn't even have to say anything. They'd be like, right, we're going. And everyone would just get up and leave. And so I didn't even feel like I had to help my friends understand that this situation is like, they saw it. They read it before I needed to say anything. And they were like, no, this is not okay. Let's go somewhere else. And that in itself created a space where it just felt like we were all equal and we were all just good mates. And we are still good friends. So I feel like I'm very lucky that I've had this international experience, that I can see what's possible. But I also live now in a country and exposed to a lot of narratives and media that suggest the opposite is true. And there's truth in both of those. And so I try and sit across them and go, right, okay, how are we going to do this? The way we communicate across social media, the rate of processing that we have to do in terms of taking in all this new information, new events, new realities, new models of how the world's going to work post-COVID, it's exhausting. And I don't think that helps. I think it silos our thinking. I mean, that's a well-documented effect, echo chambers, people becoming radicalized and in all directions, it seems. So I think it takes a conscious effort to say, let's sit down, and we may not see eye to eye on everything. Let's just say that's okay, but what can we see eye to eye on? And that's why I was interested to hear how you saw things, because I think that helped me.
And vice versa. But I think you really put your finger on it when you mentioned echo chambers, because the irony and the paradox of this accelerated and amplified communication capacity that we have now, the paradox is that it's created these echo chambers where everyone thinks that they're well connected, but thanks to Google algorithms and all the rest of it, we're really just seeing what other people like us are seeing. So yeah, my belief is that in whatever field, whether it's conservation or whatever it is, the most useful thing that we can do is to listen to as many viewpoints as possible, and to challenge viewpoints where they need to be challenged, and plenty of them do need to be challenged. But so many of them continue in their own echo chambers and never really see the light of day.
I love social media. I like Instagram. I don't have a Twitter account, but I like Instagram. I think it's a nice platform generally. But what I've recently sort of reminded myself in that it's a useful tool, but it's not the only place to do this work. And I think particularly with the effects of COVID and people being more restricted in their movement and what they can and do in events, the natural kind of way to adapt to that in terms of rolling out your content online. I think the important thing to remember is that it's just one tool. It's not the only tool available. And my mantra is like, real change happens with real conversations. Maybe I should say conservation as well, but but real change happens with real conversations. And which is why this is so great. Like, yes, we're still interacting through a digital medium, obviously, but this is the opportunity to get into things in more detail than you can in a tweet and I don't believe that's a great platform really for debating, especially when you think you're going to move into territory that is going to be tricky.
A big thank you to Gillian and for her time and energy to make that conversation possible. As I said, I think that we could have continued for ages, but she had already given me more time than we'd agreed on. I'd also like to say a special thanks to Sarah for making that interview happen behind the scenes. Next month, I'll be probing the topic of protected areas. Nature reserves and national parks and other formally protected areas are bedrocks of conservation, but they've always had a controversial side, and I wanted to get a bit of an update on that situation. I wanted to know whether protected areas really are all that effective, considering that there's no enforced global standard to ensure that they truly offer the protection that they promise. I also wanted to delve into the impacts of protected areas on some communities and a few other related questions. Brian McSharry will join me for this conversation. Brian is head of the Group for Biodiversity and Nature at the European Environment Agency in Copenhagen. He was also previously project leader of the Protected Planet Initiative, so he's well placed to help us illuminate this topic.